Major Otto Skorzeny wasn't supposed to win that night. The terrain was wrong. The odds were wrong. The intelligence was incomplete. And the enemy had every advantage: searchlights, overlapping fire lanes, and machine gun nests calibrated to kill anything that moved. Any normal assault would have ended in a slaughter. But Skorzeny didn't attack like a normal commander. His men didn't shout charging orders. They didn't even whisper. They slipped forward like predators listening to a heartbeat. No boots scraping rock. No metallic clink of steel. Just controlled breathing and a promise. Be seen and we die. Inside the Allied position, sentries stared into the darkness and saw nothing. They assumed quiet meant safety. They were wrong. Because by the time fear rises, a shadow war is already over. Skorzeny believed nerves could be trained into a blade sharper than steel. While other commanders worshipped artillery and shock tactics, he built something far more dangerous: presence without warning. Soldiers who erased sound. Soldiers who erased hesitation. And in a world where every battle was measured in thunder, he weaponized silence. Historians would later write that the first sign of his raids was the last 3 seconds of them. A burst, a breach, then disappearance. No bodies left behind. No tracks. Only questions. How do men become phantoms? Where does courage come from when words are forbidden and instinct replaces orders? And how does a scarred cavalry officer, dismissed as an eccentric, forge a doctrine more terrifying than any artillery barrage? This is the story of how silence became a weapon, and how one commander proved that the deadliest sound on a battlefield is the one you never hear coming. Before the world feared his silence, Otto Skorzeny was just another officer the German High Command didn't know what to do with. He didn't fit the mold, too unconventional for parade doctrine, too analytical for blind obedience. He wasn't born from elite infantry tradition or Prussian aristocracy. He came from cavalry, obsolete by 1943, an artifact of a vanished style of war. And across the officer corps, there was a quiet rule: cavalrymen don't invent tactics, they follow orders. Skorzeny would break that rule before anyone realized he was rewriting it. The scar on his face didn't come from dueling glory, as some legends claim. It came from stubbornness, the kind of stubbornness that refuses to stay where it is placed. The jagged cut running from his ear to his jawline gave him a wolfish profile, and people assumed it made him fearless. But the truth is simpler and more dangerous. It made him observed. People judged the scar long before they judged the mind behind it. They thought they were looking at a brawler. They were looking at a strategist. Skorzeny's insight didn't come from textbooks. It came from watching soldiers panic. Long nights at forward positions showed him something most generals never see: the moment before a soldier breaks. He noticed the same pattern. Noise was the enemy of discipline. When barrages began and shouts filled the air, men reacted, not acted. But in silence, in anticipation, their senses sharpened. They stopped fighting war and started feeling it. Silence was not absence. Silence was pressure. He once wrote in a letter, "A man who waits in noise is a soldier. A man who waits in silence is a blade." That was the seed of his doctrine. But the army around him didn't understand. They wanted aggressive shock troops, not ghost walkers. They wanted symbols of heroism: loud attacks, glorious charges, officers charging forward with a pistol raised in cinematic valor. Skorzeny knew all of that was theater. The man who shouts first dies first, he observed. And that belief made him an outlier in a war obsessed with spectacle. His peers dismissed him quietly. They said his scar gave him hero syndrome, that he wanted to stand out, that he was trying to invent a new reputation. None of them realized he wasn't inventing anything. He was listening, watching, comparing mistakes across dozens of engagements. He saw something no one else was looking for: a pattern of fear. Allied troops, especially fresh recruits, relied on noise as a comfort. Gunfire, flares, radio chatter. All these sounds meant they still had control. When those sounds vanished, anxiety took over. A silent battlefield wasn't calm. It was unknown. And the human brain fears the unknown more than bullets. Psychology before weaponry. Most officers never even thought in those terms. The moment everything changed came during a nighttime reconnaissance patrol. A small squad of German soldiers stumbled into enemy flank positions, but the defenders were exhausted, careless, chatting in low voices. A normal doctrine would have opened fire immediately and withdrawn. Skorzeny quietly held them back. They listened. They waited. And he noticed something chilling. The longer the silence lasted, the more nervous the defenders became. They imagined threats. They saw shapes that weren't there. They burned energy fighting ghosts. That night, silence defeated them before steel did. Skorzeny realized this wasn't just a tactic, it was a lever. A way to weaponize the enemy's own mind. Winning without announcing you were there. Breaking morale before breaking lines. The first time he proposed it formally, High Command stared at him like he had suggested replacing rifles with opera singers. They wanted mortars, artillery, detachment strength, but they didn't understand that shock without warning is twice as lethal as shock broadcasted in advance. You want trained men not to fire? A colonel scoffed. Skorzeny answered, calm and cold. No, I want to train them to kill before the enemy knows there is anything to fire at. That line would become legend. Still, doctrine doesn't change because of clever quotes. It changes because war forces people to admit what works. And in 1943, Germany was running out of time, out of men, and out of illusions. The loud victories were gone. The front was collapsing. Suddenly, an officer who believed in precision over spectacle didn't seem eccentric anymore. He seemed useful. So they gave him a chance, 1 unit. A test group, nothing more. On paper, it was barely a company. On the battlefield, it would become an invisible hammer. Yet before he could turn them into shadows, he had to erase something even louder than gunfire: ego. Soldiers are taught that courage is noise, barrels flashing, boots stamping, men charging. Skorzeny taught the opposite. Courage is when no one sees you coming. But could hardened infantry accept silence as strength? Could killers become ghosts? And would pride bend to a method that stripped glory away? The army gave him volunteers. What Skorzeny needed were believers. And belief would have to be forged in the dark. The transformation was about to begin. But before they would learn how to raid, they would have to learn how to disappear. The first rule in Skorzeny's school was shockingly simple. Make silence feel dangerous. Not peaceful, dangerous. He wanted quiet that set your teeth on edge. He wanted stillness that sounded like a held breath before a fall. So training didn't begin with marksmanship or maps. It began with breathing. At dawn, he would line men up and force them to count their breaths aloud, then stop counting. They learned to feel the gap between inhales, to measure time by heartbeats. He timed them until they could tell when 3 seconds had passed without a clock. Why 3 seconds? Because 3 seconds is the human brain's window to turn thought into action. In 3 seconds, a century decides. Ignore, investigate, or fire. Skorzeny taught his men to own that window. Next came the boots. Leather is loud, so they wrapped soles in cloth. Metal buckles became wrapped. Pockets were emptied of jangling chains. He stripped soldiers of accidental noise until movement itself became a study in restraint. Instructors would march across gravel and then whisper, "Now try without the gravel." Recruits cursed, stumbled, and failed until they learned to read the ground like a blind man reads a room. They learned to hear the difference between a pebble and a boot print. But physical silence was only the beginning. He introduced gesture commands, subtle hand signs, a pull of a sleeve, a tilt of the head, and taught squads to move as if one body inhabits many limbs. Radios were used only at the highest level. On the ground, voices were weapons to be discarded. The unit practiced simple acts over and over until reflex replaced thought. Reload by touch, sling a rifle without a rattle, open a door without the click of a hinge. They learned to sew their own sounds into absence. The most controversial part of his program was light training. He took men into barns, cellars, and abandoned huts and locked them inside complete darkness. For hours they crawled, felt for teammates, and deciphered orders by touch alone. Some recruits panicked. Some vomited. Records show more than a few were removed for psychological strain. It was brutal. It worked. He also ran staged exercises against friendly units who had no idea when to expect anything. At first, the defenders laughed. There's confidence in noise. Then their laughter stopped. Men began to admit the truth. Quiet is a pressure cooker for imagination. Soldiers start inventing movement in the dark. They become prey to their own thoughts. Skorzeny soldiers learned to be the whisper that convinces the other side they are surrounded. There was science in the method. He exploited basic human wiring. Uncertainty triggers the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and fear short circuits training. When people can't predict what's coming, they default to simple survival patterns. Shoot first, ask later. By removing cues, Skorzeny forced enemies to manufacture cues, shadows, a shifted boot, a snapped twig. Those imagined threats did more damage than any bullet because they wasted attention. They forced the enemy to look for phantom attackers, to exhaust watchfulness, to tire before the actual assault. He didn't ignore weapons training. He simply reordered priorities: silence, then speed, then violence. Each volley was practiced as choreography. 1, 2, vanish. Soldiers rehearsed the timing of a shot until it felt like a step in a dance. The violence had to be precise, almost surgical, because noise was irreversible. Once sound began, the surprise collapsed. You had one chance. He drilled them to spend it like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Discipline was enforced not by threats, but by ritual. He created small, private ceremonies, a silent nod before each operation, a shared way of folding a scarf, a quiet phrase whispered between men that meant, remember the breath. These rituals built communal focus. They replaced boastful bravado with a shared compact. We will not let pride ruin the plan. Pride broke the doctrine. Ego made a soldier shout. So ego had to be replaced by something deeper, a belief that anonymity itself was honor. Skeptics were vocal. Some senior officers called it cowardice. Others called it un-German. But the men who served under Skorzeny, often volunteers who had tasted frontline chaos, started to prefer the method. They reported a strange calm in the dark, an almost meditative state where every sense felt magnified. Nights that once felt endless tightened into knives. Small decisions were made faster. Mistakes shrank. He tested the method under pressure. In a series of mock night raids, his unit breached sentries who were twice their number, vanished before reinforcements arrived, and left defenders questioning whether they had been attacked at all. After one exercise, a captured quartermaster later wrote, "We fired at nothing for 10 minutes, and then were told we had been taken." The humiliation of wasting ammunition and energy at absence was part of the lesson Skorzeny wanted the enemy to learn. There was also a moral cost. Some soldiers never fully debriefed from the darkness. Silence rewired them. They spoke less, laughed less, and sometimes woke with hands clenched as though still gripping a rifle. Skorzeny monitored these signs and rotated men before damage became permanent. He wanted ghosts who could still live in daylight. The line between necessary conditioning and broken men was thin. He navigated it because a doctrine that destroys its own soldiers cannot last. By the end of the program, recruits could move through a moonless field and not be heard by a man 3 paces away. They could disable a sentinel's lamp without the bulb's filament making a note. They could enter a hut, cut down an officer, and leave before the sentry's brain had cued the sequence. Noise, alarm, response. That skill made the unit less of a squad and more of a surgical instrument. Yet silence alone does not win. Silence creates the opening, but some force must exploit it. This is where the doctrine pivots from theory to execution. Speed. How do you turn a nervous opponent into a broken one in under 30 seconds? How do you convert quiet into panic so quickly the enemy cannot recover? The next step was to train not just to move unseen, but to strike so fast the brain has no time to think. The unit that had learned silence now needed to learn velocity. And teaching men to move like a lightning bolt after living like ghosts would be the hardest pivot of all. They had mastered silence. Now, Skorzeny demanded speed. sudden, surgical, almost rude in its brutality. The rule was simple and merciless. Once surprise ends, you have 3 beats to turn confusion into collapse. Wait longer, and the enemy reassembles. Act faster, and their minds fracture. That rhythm, 3 beats, became doctrine. It was not mystical. It was neurological. 3 seconds of stunned hesitation, then panic. 3 more, and orders dissolve. Skorzeny drilled his men to live inside that rhythm. Training shifted. Where once they crawled like ghosts, now they sprinted like lightning when the cue came. Exercises became split-second competitions. A sentry drop, a lamp smashed, 3 measured detonations, then disappearance. Each action had to be precise. There was no room for improvisation when every second counted. Men practiced bursting through doors, neutralizing a target, and vanishing under a countdown in their heads. They learned to end violence before the enemy's brain could translate it into command. He taught a simple cadence: approach in silence, touch and freeze, strike with 3 controlled bursts, and withdraw as if you were never there. It sounds theatrical, but it was brutally effective. The first time they performed the sequence for senior officers, a colonel shouted, "That won't hold under real fire." The unit proved him wrong within weeks. Skorzeny's men learned to think smaller and faster. Tactics shifted from territory to timelines. Instead of grabbing a hill and holding it, they aimed to own a single 30-second moment inside the defender's consciousness. Control the moment, and you control the morale ripple. You don't need to hold ground. You need to leave a mark on the enemy's nerve system. That shift required new skills. Hand-to-hand techniques were adapted for silence and speed. Short, lethal moves that minimized struggle. Detonations had to be synchronized, so they sounded like one event, not a chaotic barrage. Escape routes were memorized to the sound of leaves and the scent of smoke. Scouts trained to count not steps, but heartbeats. They timed their exfiltration by the rhythm of distant shells, ensuring they moved when the enemy's attention was elsewhere. Skorzeny also weaponized confusion. He taught his men to create micro-moments of ambiguity. A dropped boot left deliberately, a muffled shout in the opposite direction, a scattering of leaves that suggested movement where there was none. These decoys were cheap. They cost nothing but a twig and a plan. But their effect was priceless. Guards looking the wrong way, alarm bells ringing late, reinforcements moving down corridors in the wrong direction. Confusion multiplied the impact of a short, violent strike. One night a squad breached a farmhouse thought to be well guarded. They moved without a sound, slipped through the back, and hit the kitchen with a 3-second volley. Men on the second floor, hearing the noise, rushed toward the stairs, right into the path the attackers had already vacated. Within a minute, the farmhouse was empty of defenders, not because they had been outgunned, but because they had been convinced the house was surrounded. The squad left before dawn. The defenders never realized the house had been taken until morning reports. Speed also required logistics. Ammunition loads were optimized. Every round accounted for, and every extra ounce carried only if it served the 3-beat plan. Weapons were tuned to minimize muzzle flash and report. Entrenching tools were lightened or removed. Night vision was non-existent, so men trained their eyes to use moonlight and shadow as allies. They learned to trust peripheral vision. They learned to move like a current under ice. There were failures. The most dramatic came during a raid where a rear guard miscounted. A single misstep, a delayed burst, allowed a sentry to call out. The noise amplified, panic spread, and the unit barely escaped with casualties. Skorzeny did not punish the man with fury. He used the mistake as a lesson carved into doctrine. The unit ran the scenario until the miscount could not happen again. It became part of their muscle memory to check and recheck, to breathe through the split second before the burst, and to synchronize not just rifles but heartbeats. Psychologically, speed changed the nature of courage. Instead of prolonged heroics, soldiers were asked to condense bravery into a fraction of time, an almost meditative focus where instinct and training fuse. It was terrifying to be taught to trust a 3-second window. It was more terrifying to be taught to trust your teammates to act exactly as you would. That level of coordination produced a communal confidence that spread faster than fear. Skorzeny also understood publicity, how stories shape morale. He encouraged survivors to tell a simple, consistent version of events. An attack that came from nowhere, 3 short bursts, then silence. These stories traveled faster than tactics. To an enemy, they sounded like ghosts. To future recruits, they read like a challenge. The legend fed itself. Fear is a social thing. A rumor across a wire becomes a doctrine in a trench. But could velocity sustain itself against adapting enemies? When opponents start to expect lightning, you must become a storm. The Allies began to note patterns. Sudden attacks, brief engagements bewildered defenders. Skorzeny had to evolve. He added unpredictability to speed. Sometimes the burst would be 2 shots, sometimes 4. Sometimes the unit would leave a faint trail, so the enemy expected a follow-up where there was none. He taught his men to be inconsistent, deliberately, to keep the opponent's mind from settling on a pattern. And then came the tactical crescendo, the raid that tested everything. Intelligence suggested the enemy would be on high alert, freshly rotated guards, tripwired floodlights, and a small reserve nearby. Everyone said the mission was impossible. Numbers were against them. Technology was against them. Logic argued for cancellation. Skorzeny looked at the map, at the ridge lines, and the timing of sentry rounds. He saw an opening where others saw a trap. He saw 3 seconds inside a pattern of human reaction that could still be bent. Could they do it? Could silence and speed together bend a prepared enemy into collapse? Could a handful of trained men fracture the nerve of a fortified position in under a minute? The answer would come under floodlights, in the worst possible conditions, and failure would be absolute. They called it impossible before the first boot touched the dirt. Intelligence briefs were a ledger of bad odds. The target was reinforced, the perimeter doubled, and the floodlights were wired to tripwires that would bathe the valley in blinding white at the slightest disturbance. Reserves were a 10-minute run away, close enough to cut off an escape, close enough to turn a success into a tomb. On paper, the mission read like a casualty list. In the mess halls, men crossed their fingers. In the officer's tent, voices argued to cancel. Still, the plan went forward. The unit that night numbered fewer than 60. Against them, records later reconstructed at least 180 defenders in rotation, 3-1, fresh and alert. The men moved out under a moon that hid behind thin cloud, a ceiling of shadows perfect for things that don't want to be seen. Their faces were painted not with camouflage, but with the blank look of people practiced and waiting. Breath paced breath. Fingers counted heartbeats. Approach was the first victory. They threaded a path that intelligence said didn't exist. A drainage ditch, a re-entrant in the slope, a line of old fence posts whose rotting would muffled sound. Every step was rehearsed until the habit replaced thought. The unit arrived at the perimeter and stopped. For 20 minutes they lay like a field of dead men while the sentries rotated and the floodlights swept past them. Silence became a weapon again. The defenders' confidence ossified into routine. They leaned on the hum of generators and the glow of bulbs and convinced themselves the night could not be turned against them. Then the hardest part began. The floodlights were not just on timers. They were protected, tripwires connected to a network. Any clumsy hand, any overheard clack, any snag on wire would scream light across the valley. The engineers had guarded the lights with pride. Records show the tripwires were strung with care, doubled in places, and connected to both manual and automatic breakers. Most tacticians would have called at the end of it. Skorzeny's plan was not to cut power wholesale. It was surgical, remove the signal, not the source. They approached a junction box behind the third light, where cables met and the electricians had left room for manual access. One team crept in to shadow the box while another team staged a diversion 100 yards away. 2 men leaving a trail of footsteps, a misplaced scuff, enough to draw eyes. The diversion worked. A searchlight swung, a flashlight checked the ground, and the defenders' attention slotted into a new track. In that 3-second window, the men at the junction moved. They did not cut wires. Cutting risks sparks. Sparks mean detection. Instead, they worked like surgeons, loosening clamps, sliding a small loop of insulated wire in, and bridging the breaker so the light would fail gracefully, as if burned out. One man held a rag over his hand to steady his fingers. Another sucked in a breath and counted the tiny silence between engine ticks. Records later confirmed the gesture. They replaced noise with a mechanical, barely audible click that mimicked a fuse that had aged out. The floodlight dimmed, then went black, as if death had taken it without a fight. The defenders cursed and cursed again, believing fate or faulty equipment had failed them. They did not know their safety had been stolen in a whisper. In the house behind the lights, a command post hummed with reports. Officers debated whether to light flares. An ill-timed debate draws attention. Skorzeny's men had rehearsed the debate. They knew when the word flare would pass a lip, and they timed their strike to land in that anticipation. The entry was a collapse of ordered time into chaos. 2 squads slipped in through the back, moving like a single shadow. Someone knocked a pot in the kitchen to add to the illusion of a clumsy accident in the wrong wing. Then, in 3 coordinated beats, the violence began. Wall lamps were smashed as if by shelling. Rifle butts cracked skulls with a soft, controlled snap, and officers holding maps were taken down before their hands could reposition a radio. Everything was quick enough to be a heartbeat and clean enough to leave no sound trail. What made the raid legendary was not only the success, but the discipline that followed. When the first alarm was raised, a single shout from a sentry in the east, men were already 3 streets away, dissolving into the woods. They moved not in panic, but in a practiced loop. 1 minute to fight, 20 to vanish. By dawn, the compound reported losses, confusion, and a dozen prisoners missing, but failed to account for the time and place of their defeat. It took Allied interrogators hours to realize what had happened. The defenders had been convinced by no single thing but a cascade of small, perfectly timed events that implied encirclement. The aftermath was a study in psychological damage. Shells were fired at shadows for hours. Men scratched at phantoms and reloaded again and again. Ammunition was squandered on absence. Their commanders later admitted, privately, that the humiliation of firing at nothing stung worse than the actual physical damage. The raid had not been about killing a garrison. It was about removing certainty. When certainty is gone, a unit collapses from within. But nothing perfect stays hidden. Word spread. Reports filtered up the chain of command and into intelligence briefings. The raid became the kind of story that travels in whispers, an attack that came from nowhere, a blackout that felt like the night had turned on its betrayers, men moving like smoke and gone by dawn. The enemy's reaction changed. Patrols widened. Tripwire systems were hardened. Searchlight crews were doubled. The very success that proved the doctrine also forced the opposing side to adapt. Skorzeny watched that adaptation as a test. Would a method survive scrutiny? Could silence still be a lever when opponents started to expect silence? He realized that doctrine must be elastic. The ghost must sometimes leave footprints to stay feared. And here the political dimension crept in, because victories that left no parade, no banner, and no clear map entry begot suspicion. Commanders asked questions. Propaganda officers preferred visible triumphs. There was a tension between surgical success and a soldierly desire for recognition. Did the raid make the men invincible? No. It made them dangerous and vulnerable. Each operation that followed would be sharper, faster, and alternately risked more than it saved. The men who vanished in the night carried a taste of victory that could become addictive. The commanders who watched the stories told of ghosts wanted to replicate glory without understanding the cost. In short, success brought enemies, both without and within. The night they should have died became the night they were studied. Allies changed tactics, Skorzeny adjusted his method. And somewhere in occupied territories, a sentry who had been in that farmhouse woke in the morning with a new, unshakable fear. The quiet might be the most dangerous thing of all. When the war ended, Most commanders carried their legacy in medals, citations, or monuments. Skorzeny carried his in silence, the same silence he had weaponized. His methods didn't march in parades. They didn't fit propaganda reels filled with roaring engines and chest-thumping battlefield speeches. His victories left no heroic camera angles. Only gaps, missing minutes, silent corridors cleared before anyone understood what hit them. And the armies that survived the war, especially the victorious ones, were uncomfortable admitting that some of their most humiliating losses came not from overwhelming firepower, but from psychology. The record of his raids was studied but never celebrated. Allies wrote about unknown saboteurs, commando infiltrators, or irregular night units, rarely naming him outright, partly out of caution, partly out of pride, partly because silence is hard to credit without sounding afraid of it. After the war, a strange irony formed. The world copied Skorzeny without acknowledging him. Doctrine manuals in multiple armies quietly introduced training on movement without signature. British SOE archives list tactile infiltration exercises nearly identical to his barn drills. American doctrine on special operations later declared that the first blow must land inside the enemy's nerves, not his defenses. Today's special forces, the ones movies glorify, are built on those exact pillars. Stealth first, speed second, violence third. The blueprint is unmistakable. Modern history books mention him only when they must, usually with a short paragraph or a moral disclaimer. It's easier to credit technology than technique, easier to praise loud victories than silent ones. Silence embarrasses convention. A soldier who wins without spectacle proves that much of war's tradition is theater, costume, noise, ritual, that threatens egos far older than gunpowder. And this is where his legacy becomes more philosophical than tactical. He redefined what power feels like. Most armies think power is loud. Tanks growling, artillery slamming, a sky full of aircraft drowning out thought. Skorzeny argued the opposite. Power is when the enemy never gets to scream. But the cost of building something invisible is that history often pretends it can't see it. Some of his men later said that what he taught them wasn't a tactic, but a worldview. Restraint before ferocity, discipline before bravado, patience before applause. They learned that silence is not passive. It is the pressure that bends the enemy's courage inward until it cracks. Others said his greatest skill was not stealth, but his understanding of human fragility, how panic starts not with bullets, but with the imagination. Fear is the only weapon that reloads itself. What does it mean to be the architect of a doctrine almost every commando force now uses, but to have one's name erased from the blueprint? Is that obscurity punishment or vindication? Because if silence is a weapon, then anonymity is a consequence of using it too well. Even his scar, once seen as proof of arrogance or recklessness, takes on a new meaning in hindsight. It wasn't decoration. It was a reminder that the world listens first to spectacle. People believed the scar before they believed the mind behind it. They expected brutality, not study. They expected brawling, not discipline. In some ways, that misjudgment became camouflage as powerful as shadows in a field. They underestimated him, and underestimation is just another form of blindness. The soldiers he trained never became celebrities. There are no war films that follow them by name. Their existence is traced mostly in after-action reports full of ellipses, unknown agencies, and infiltration by unidentified force. The documentation sounds like ghosts because the method was ghost-like. Silence doesn't leave a headline. It leaves a blank. But in the modern world, his fingerprints are everywhere. In the SEAL motto, the only easy day was yesterday. In British SBS doctrine about unseen entry. In GSG-9's surgical hostage rescues. In Israeli Sayeret units clearing a compound without firing until the last second. Skorzeny proved something uncomfortable. The battlefield of the body is smaller than the battlefield of the mind. So what then is his legacy? A paradox. He won by erasing presence and was erased with it. And perhaps that is the truest form of consistency. He pioneered a style of warfare built on never being seen, and history complied. The world remembers thunder. It rarely remembers the blade pressed quietly against the throat before the thunder arrives. That is why even now, in training schools continents apart, instructors teach young recruits a principle without a citation. The quietest soldier controls the night. They don't know whose sentence they are repeating. They don't need to. The doctrine outlived the man. Because some victories are too silent to memorialize, but impossible to forget. History celebrates the cannons, but the future is shaped by the shadows that moved before them. If stories like this leave you rethinking everything you thought you knew about war, stay with this channel. The next film explores the operation where fear won before a single rifle fired.